most of them will never be used. Now, what is your idea about their status or about the very fact that we create such beings?
Terrific question. Could you all hear the question? And can you hear me if I just talk from here? The question is, to distill it, what about in vitro fertilization and I think more pointedly, the destruction of unused embryos? Okay. Logic is not like a bus. You can't just get off when you reach the stop you want to stop at. Right? If a new, distinct human biological life is created by the fertilization of the egg by the sperm, which is my limited scientific understanding of what in vitro fertilization is, there is a new, distinct human life created there. Okay? To destroy a new, distinct human life because it is not of use to others is to kill that life. Now, this actually feeds in really well to one of Caitlin's points. You take a poll, 80, 90% of Americans will not agree with that proposition. In fact, one of the reasons I think that the pro-life movement's arguments encounter resistance is because it is almost unbearable to think that many of our most common and accepted practices might be fundamentally morally wrong, or at least, that we don't want to look, we don't want to examine. I think that in vitro fertilization and the familiarity of abortion being had, many of us know, have family members, friends, acquaintances, people who've had abortions, lead to such an enormous cognitive dissonance. If we were to accept the premise that it's an independent biological human life, oh my gosh, what would that make us? Okay? But logic is not like a bus. Okay? And I think it's hard for people to hold their eyes open and to accept that cognitive dissonance. And I think the resistance to it is not because of the weakness of the argument, but because of the perceived unacceptability of its consequences, because we call into question a lot of what we do. Again, I think there's a perfect analogy to slavery. It was unacceptable for vast portions of the South to think of the institution of slavery as fundamentally morally wrong, and to be confronted with that reality was about the most offensive thing to Southern honor that could have been imagined.
Can I respond to this one? One thing I really appreciate about Professor Paulsen's presentation and his positions is that he is one of the most consistent thinkers or scholars in this area that I know of. And that's important for people to hear, because that is the consequence of the pro-life position. That is the ultimate position. If you can't live with that, right? So, and I think that the idea, right, the idea is not just the gravity of our moral offense if we realize that we have all these embryos stored, and it's a gut check. Like, is that slavery? So if you all have a printed sheet of paper in front of you, look at a period on that page, all right? Is that dot the same as a slave? You've got to do that gut check, right? What he is saying is that's a person, the same as you and me.
Oh, hey, I get to jump back in on this. Thank you very much, first of all. I do take a principled position. It gets me into trouble sometimes, but I think you have to try to take principled positions and follow them. Biologically, I wouldn't say it's period on page, because that's a piece of ink, but a very, very, very small, distinct human biological organism is its own human moral person. The fact that it is small and is vulnerable, that it could be easily killed, does not change its status. I am the same human biological organism that I was as a teenager. I'm a little fatter now. And as a child, and as a toddler, and as a newborn, and as a fetus, and as an embryo, and as a zygote. Whatever was... I wrote down during Caitlin's presentation that, was it Lindsey Graham says 20 weeks, you become you? Nah. whatever I am and was as a biological organism, I was at the point of fertilization of eggs. That's the distinct human life form as a biological matter. And you're right. You have to deal with that. Now, one other thing. I do respect the people in the pro-life movement who tactically say, let's save 180,000 lives if we can today, right? My colleague, Teresa Clay. Let's save as many as we can. And actually, I understand as a practical, tactical matter that if it is politically unacceptable to go all the way to destruction of embryos in terms of what you would prohibit, but you can save a few million lives over the next decade, I'll take the few million lives that I can save. And I'm influenced in that by Lincoln's position, too. He was an anti-slavery moderate. He said, there's some things we cannot accomplish. We cannot abolish slavery in the states where it exists now, but we can limit its spread, and we can adopt as the moral principle of our political action, the correct moral principle, and go as far with it as we are politically able at the time. So, yes, logic leads me all the way there, but practicality might provide, important cutoff points.
I'd like to just say that that comparison you're making would carry over to the abolitionist movement. It had a huge spectrum, all the way from moral suasion. There's no room for the law to go after slavery. You should just convince people that slavery is wrong, all the way to John Brown on the other side.
There were anti-slavery moderates, and there were the Garrisonians who would burn the Constitution and secede from the South. No union with slaveholders. And there were pacifists, and there were violent resistors, and there are all sorts of interesting and to some extent disturbing analogies to the abortion controversy.
This is circle marketing, but I was wondering whether or not the more appropriate analogy is not with this movement and the abolitionist movement, but with the temperance movement and prohibition. And there was excessive abuses, and there were concerns about immorality tied to abuses of alcohol. But it appeared historically now, in retrospect, that a constitutional ban, an outright legal solution, was not the most efficacious. And so, for example, I'm wondering whether or not, for that analogy to be more appropriate, whether if we had a situation where employers now, because of feeling like pregnancy led to a gross economic disadvantage, were allowed to order mass sterilization of employees or forced abortion or coerced contraceptive use, etc. And then the state validated that and enforced it, whether then you would have more of a parallel structure. And so these are some questions that I have as a result of your talk.
I was following you on temperance, but I didn't follow the compelled employer one. But I'll let you come back at that. But on temperance, I think that's an interesting analogy. And let me just sort of globalize it. So much of law is the regulation of private behavior for perceived public good. Okay? And some of it we think, you shouldn't do that. You should let people do what they want. Okay? And that's where I come down. I had a beer at the Southern Inn last night with everybody else. That's where I come down on temperance. I think the huge difference is, the question of externality and harm to others. And that's, to me, what unites very persuasively the slavery situation with the abortion situation is, we don't permit people to make their own decisions or self-regulate with respect to slavery because there's another person's life at stake, so we will constrain human autonomy for perceived social good for the benefit of otherwise injured other people. And that's the way I think that the abortion argument works too. And it only doesn't work if you deny the human moral status of the fetus. And what's interesting, that's the parallel with the Southern fire eaters' denial of the moral status, the equal human worth of African Americans became sort of an essential problem of the argument. Now, what is the employer coerced?
Well, I want to address that also about temperate movement, because my understanding is because so many abuses were occurring, women getting killed by husbands that were abusing the abortion thing. And so if we did have mass, like I said, forced contraceptive use, or mass sterilization, or forced abortions, and it was also conducted by private employers, private entities, in a systemic way, like slavery as an institution was implemented, then I could see more clearly the parallels, and also the economic advantages I could see with that type of institution.
Right. I'm not quite sure I get the analogy, but let me make this broad point. Is we often regulate private harm done by one person to another, right? Private misconduct. So, I would resist employers, private employers, engaged in coerced abortion or discrimination, the same as I would with the government. And actually, I think that, the first duty of government is protection of individuals from the private predations of other individuals, right? That's the origin of the state and political philosophy. So I think the first duty of government, and where you draw the line of various issues, is I think, the challenge. The first duty of government is to protect individuals from the private violence of others. And that would include slavery, and in my estimation, that would include abortion as an act of privacy, of private violence committed by one person against another member of the human family.
Right there, yeah. You, yeah.
Professor Borgmann, I was wondering if you could comment on Professor Paulsen's, he's carried the argument all the way through, which he commented on. Could you comment on his sort of, not accusation, but his commentary on the pro-choice movements, or to choice to carry the argument all the way through to complete women's autonomy, and whether or not there should be restrictions or any sort of limitations, or is it completely a woman's choice? I mean, he brought up sex selection and things of that nature, but do you see any room for restrictions?
Well, I think that the important point that I'm trying to make is that if you favor restrictions, you have to accurately identify the problem that restriction is supposed to remedy, right? So we can take sex selection as an example, but I just want to make one point, which is that a response was made about the abortion, about the slavery analogy, which was that, even if you think slavery is a moral absolute in terms of being wrong, incremental progress is still defensible, right? And I just want to say that is an acknowledgement, right? That 20-week bans and sex selection, abortion are not about the purported reasons, right? So what I want to look at is whether the purported reasons are really the reasons, right? So for a sex selection abortion ban, for example, I'd want to know what's the concern, right? So a concern that was raised yesterday was that we have a problem with female embryos and fetuses being aborted more, and that reflects sex discrimination, right? Now, we don't have that problem in the United States, right? So that is not a problem that needs fixing in the United States. If we did, maybe we'd have to think about it, right? But I would also argue that there are many, many things that have to happen in China besides preventing sex selection abortions, right? I mean, that culture, of viewing females as sufficiently inferior that people would want to do that, right, has many, many roots, of which abortion would be like a small Band-Aid, right, to fix that. So that's the kind of conversation that I'd want to have, right? What is the restriction? What is it meant to do? And then, is this the right answer, right? And that's a conversation I would totally welcome. I mean, who knows what we would all agree on, right? It's very, very different from the conversation that we have today.
Can I jump in on that? Let me tell you my motivation for strongly favoring sex selection bans. Okay? Wow. Number one, is that ever good politics and symbolism? It is tactically right, to say Do you go all the way down the slippery slope? And I'm going to make you answer this, Caitlin. Do you go all the way down the slippery slope and say, in the name of women's equality, we will defend a right to abort on the basis of gender? And it does happen in the United States. It's not nearly to the same degree as in certain Asian nations, but it does happen, and it can happen under the legal regime. My motivation is to say, is to really to undermine that equality autonomy argument by saying, look where that leads you. Do you really embrace that? Is that really the extremism of your position? And to present you with a dilemma, okay? Because if you say, no, that would be wrong, that would be bad, that would be harmful to women, that would be discriminatory, I'd say, why? It has to be because what you are killing is not an it. It's a girl, right? To take an expression of popular joy. You know, it is a human life. And that does provide a wedge to a broader restriction of abortion. Wait a minute. If it is a human life, if it is a girl, isn't it a girl if you kill it for other reasons too? I do want to make people think about it. But the other thing is, if I can't forbid all abortions, if I can make people think about what the abortion is doing, and if I can at least get the foothold of people thinking it is wrong to abort a child because of its sex, and if I can save some female lives that way and avoid other real social problems that could flow from it, I want to do that too.
Kate, would you like to respond?
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but I do disagree that just because I disagree that an embryo, so I have a daughter, for example, right? She's 19. I just don't see an embryo as, even if it's a female, it's going to be a girl if it is, makes it through the entire process of pregnancy and becomes a person. It would be a girl like her, right? It's just, we're using the term girl as shorthand, but to me it's not the same, and I think for obviously the vast majority of people, it isn't. So I don't think that's a concession in that sense. And I think that there are a lot of odd consequences to viewing, to the idea that personhood actually begins at fertilization. Remembering, of course, that fertilization is not like this moment, right? It's a process. So at what point in that, something like 30-day process, I think it is, or no, sorry, not 30-day, 36-hour process, or 30-hour process, is this now a person, right? I mean, we have twins, for example, that form after that point. So are they the same person? If you become you at fertilization, at some point in the process of fertilization, are twins the same person? Similarly, many, many embryos don't make it to implantation, right? I mean, is that a tragedy? Is that a Holocaust that we are losing? We ought to be investing a lot of medical research into how to prevent that from happening, right? But I mean, people are not concerned about that. A large percentage of pregnancies don't ever make it, even to the implantation stage, or end in very early miscarriages that women assume are late periods. And we're not concerned about that as a moral issue. Now, Professor Paulsen, I assume, would think we ought to be. But I'm just asking you all whether that all rings morally true to you.
Yes.
I find it really, to use slavery, I'm really bothered by that because of the fact that up until, say, the 1970s, you could consider women slaves, especially in that time frame that you're talking about in the 1800s, because women, even rich women, were slaves to their husband. They were property, considered property. So to that wouldn't involve women. But I wonder if you would expend as much energy on your side, of the male side of this. Are you expending as much energy to do anything about male birth control? Or Planned Parenthood years ago put on advertisements about aimed at teenage boys to get them to use condoms. That lasted 3 days because everybody, they didn't like that idea. So what are we doing on the other side rather than just on my side as a woman? I mean, because we could prevent abortions in other ways if you guys would just keep your pants zipped up, you know?
Okay. There's a lot there, and some of it is confusing. Let me just sort of unpack it and just state what I think are my clear premises. Well, Diana, I'm actually gratified that the analogy bothers you. I think that's good. It's my purpose to disturb it, and to provoke and to get you to think about it. I consider myself a feminist and an aggressive defender of women's rights. I'm a pro-life feminist. But my wife, my daughter, my sisters, my colleagues, I believe that historically the unequal treatment of women and the treatment of them traditionally as property or an adjunct of the husband is legally reprehensible, and it's not consistent with my own Christian theology. So the fact that women were discriminated against is one evil, and I think that abortion on demand is permitted is another and rather different evil. I think they're just sort of separate things. I think the burden or the animus of the animating spirit of your argument is one of like challenging male hypocrisy and stuff like that. The idea that and I bet there's some of that. Yeah. But I will accept right conclusions from wrong premises when they exist. And I'm actually, though I teach at a Catholic law school, and my colleague who is here might slap me down for saying this, I'm a defender of contraception. I think contraception is morally distinct from abortion. Contraception, if a true contraception, operates to thwart the existence and creation of a new independent human life. Abortion takes or kills a new independent human life. I won't go into twinning and embryos, except other than this, 2 quick points. Your daughter was that spec, and she was a girl from the time she was conceived. The genetic material for sexual identity. So, yeah, she was. A person's a person, no matter how small. As to twinning, there's a really interesting philosophical argument by a professor at St. Thomas in the philosophy department, a young guy named Matthew Liu, who was at a conference that we were both at, discussing, sorting these out. And I can't do justice to it because it had all these philosophical terms in it, but it basically says the fact that more than one person might result does not defeat the existence of personhood or distinct, human life status at the time of creation. Just sort of as a philosophical parsing. But I think that's a very interesting point.
Can I just respond on the issue of being able to be a feminist and be pro-life? If you're as consistent as Professor Paulsen, these are some of the consequences that will occur, right? Women will have to be imprisoned for abortions. It's murder, right? I mean, arguably capital punishment, right? I mean, it's deliberate murder. Women will die because abortions will not be permitted. You can just look to countries like Colombia that ban abortions. Women die because of it. Ireland. We have had a number of recent cases where women have died. The woman in Colombia who was the subject of the litigation there that resulted in a loosening, actually, of that country's abortion laws, had 4 children, and she had cancer. And she was denied an abortion, and her children now don't have their mother. You will have 11-year-old victims of incest who will be forced to carry those pregnancies to term. Right? You will have women who will have to be criminally investigated if they come in for a miscarriage, because who knows? Maybe they deliberately caused that, or maybe some other person did. Right? Women will not be able to finish their educations in many circumstances. Women will stay in poverty if they are already in poverty and are forced to continue to have children that they can't afford, rather than wait until a time that they can. So those are some of the consequences we'd have to be prepared to live with, and they don't sound very feminist to me.
Can I object to one of them and actually defend some of the others? I think that the philosophical argument or the moral argument against abortion does, the fact that it's taking the life does not prevent self-defense techniques, and actually true justifications of threat to the life or of the woman involved are permissible justifications for abortion on the grounds of tragic necessity. It's actually analogous to the arguments you would make for the regrettable moral permissibility of going to war in certain circumstances, defense of others, that's a tragic circumstance. As to interference with education, as to interference with poverty, I would not find that sufficient to justify the killing of another in order to advance those interests. The ones that are really, really troubling are rape and incest, but actually for precisely the reasons you observed in your speech. And I wrote it down because I think I strongly agree with this, that the value of the life of the human embryo or fetus does not depend on the reason for abortion. And I actually think that, as tragic and as awful as it sounds, a situation of rape or incest, it does not justify killing. I have a short web article on the Public Discourse website called The Irrelevance of Rape. If we wouldn't permit the consequence of rape to permit the killing of a born child when the existence of that born child to the mother is hugely disturbing and emotionally upsetting because it is a life, okay, then really the focus should be on whether it is a life, okay? And so I do follow the logic all the way where it leads. In that, as much as I would wish to advance the cause of women's equality and autonomy, I don't think that yields properly or should a right to kill another.
On the life exceptions, women will still die, all right? Ireland has a life exception to its abortion ban. And Savita Halappanavar had a life-threatening emergency that doctors disastrously mischaracterized as not threatening her life. These things are not, it's easy to say philosophically, and then we can say, oh, yes, it'd be fine. They'd get abortions when their life is in danger. But someone has to make that decision, and medicine is not that easy. It's hard, for the same reasons that Professor Beck was talking about viability determinations. It is very hard to determine when, and what are the percentages? 50% likely to die, 70%, 80%? These determinations are not as easy as we think they are when we're imagining them in theory. And so, as a result, someone's going to make these determinations, and women will die if we get it wrong.
I think we have time. I'm going to let the editor-in-chief ask the last question.
Well, thank you. It's never been more painfully obvious to me how little I know about this area of law than the last couple of days, but the question I have for Professor Paulsen is, taking your logic to its end, I think, if it is a life, and the woman's like from the very beginning, then when she drinks alcohol, is that providing alcohol to a minor? Should we arrest her for that? She takes drugs, she's providing drugs to someone who shouldn't be taking them. Is that illegal? I mean, if she falls and hurts them, is she battering for life? I mean, I'm just not sure. I don't know where any of these go, because I haven't thought of them longer than the last 3 seconds when it came to me, but it just sort of seems like that door is now open for your logic, isn't it not? Is it not?
You're a great law student. That's how you got to be editor-in-chief. You can see the analogies in any of these situations. What you may not know is, there are laws and instances of where a mother so abuses her body as to injure the fetus.
Sure,
right? No. But there have been challenges. There have been challenges and prohibitions brought on those grounds the primary defense has been like, well, wait, if this is something that I would have a right to abort anyway, how can you interfere with my abuse of my body and abusing another? I think in principle, very serious abuses of the body. I wouldn't say giving alcohol to a minor. That's almost like that's a wordplay, right? That's just a joke. But to poison the body in such a way as to poison the fetus might very properly become, in a pro-life world, the subject of legitimate regulation. It's a tort.
Professor, what would you do with me? I had a spontaneous abortion. Would you arrest me because my body threw it away? I mean, the lines are so iffy.
Oh, well, it actually goes to the question you raised earlier, is, the life is not the less a life because it might die naturally, right? I'm going to die by the time I'm 54. I'm 2/3 done. I know that, right? And the fact of death, probable death, inevitable death, possible death, statistical death, does not deny the existence of life. And, I think miscarriages are tragic and often treated as such by the pregnant women and pregnant families. Because at some level the intuition is that's the loss of a life. But there's a difference between the loss of a life as a consequence of the operations of nature that we cannot always understand or prevent, and the loss of a life by virtue of our deliberate action to cause it to die.
I think in view of my pro-life stance, I'm going to give Caitlin the last word. If you have anything you'd like to say in response to anything, and then we will pray.
You've been a great audience.
So let's